The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying the scent of decay and rot that clung to the air. The once grand asylum, now abandoned and forgotten, stood in eerie silence, its towering structure a decaying testament to the horrors that had taken place within its walls. Nature had long since reclaimed much of the building, with ivy crawling up its sides, its tendrils creeping over shattered windows like a silent hand, pulling the asylum into a deep, unyielding slumber. But despite the stillness, despite the dilapidated state of the building, something about the place still felt alive. Something dark. As you step closer, your footsteps echo loudly in the empty hallways, the sound unnervingly sharp in the dead silence. The walls, once white and pristine, are now stained with time, yellowed by years of neglect. The remnants of a shattered past are scattered all around, rusted equipment, torn pieces of paper, and photographs of long-forgotten faces, their eyes frozen in time. These were the faces of the men and women who had once walked these halls, their lives forever marked by the place that had claimed them. But this wasn't just any abandoned asylum. This was a place where the line between healing and harm was dangerously blurred. This was a place where the darkest secrets of the human mind were explored without restraint. And as we stand here, amidst the ruins, we realize that those secrets are still waiting to be uncovered, secrets that were never meant to be revealed. The asylum had been built over a century ago, designed to be a place of refuge for those suffering from mental illnesses. In its early years, it was hailed as a beacon of hope, a revolutionary facility that promised to cure the afflicted and return them to society. It was a vision of compassion and care. But over time, something went horribly wrong. The same walls that had once echoed with the laughter of the hopeful now echoed with screams, despair, and the sinister whispers of those who had been abandoned by the very system meant to protect them. Rumors began to swirl about the place long before it was abandoned. Patients who came in seeking help were never seen again. Whispers of unethical practices and strange, inhumane treatments began to spread, but they were always dismissed. After all, who would believe the claims of a few troubled souls, some of whom were institutionalized for the most minor of reasons? As the years went by, those who had once hoped to heal were silenced by the very institution that was supposed to save them. It wasn't until the asylum's final days, when it was being closed down for good, that the full extent of its horrors started to surface. As workers began to sift through the crumbling building, they uncovered something that had been buried for far too long: medical records, hidden files, and photographs that told a different story, one that had been carefully concealed behind closed doors for decades. Dr. Edward Blackwell was the man at the center of it all. A brilliant, if somewhat unconventional, psychiatrist, Blackwell had come to the asylum in the early 1920s with grand plans to revolutionize the field of mental health treatment. His methods were bold, his ideas groundbreaking. But as time went on, those ideas began to take darker turns. Blackwell had gained a reputation for pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in psychiatric treatment. His methods were unorthodox, to say the least. He believed that the mind could be reset through extreme measures, shock therapies, experimental drugs, and invasive surgeries that were never approved by any medical board. His patients, many of them struggling with basic mental illnesses, became his test subjects, their bodies and minds subjected to torturous experiments in the name of scientific discovery. At first, there was little suspicion. After all, these were the early days of psychiatry, and many of the practices that are now considered barbaric were once thought to be legitimate treatments. But as Blackwell's experiments grew more extreme, the stories began to spread. Whispers of patients being locked away for months, their minds broken beyond repair. Rumors of dark, hidden chambers in the bowels of the asylum where the most difficult cases were taken, never to be seen again. In those final years, as the asylum teetered on the edge of collapse, some began to question what was really happening behind the closed doors of the building. What was Blackwell hiding? And why were so many patients disappearing without a trace? As workers and investigators sifted through the old records, they uncovered unsettling clues, photographs of patients before and after their treatments, starkly contrasting images that revealed the true nature of Blackwell's work. One particular photograph, found in the darkest corner of the asylum's records room, showed a young woman, once vibrant and full of life, her face now a grotesque mask of terror and pain. The caption beneath the image read simply, "Before and after shock therapy." It was a haunting image, one that left a sickening feeling in the pit of the stomach, and it was only the beginning. What they found next was even more chilling, doctors' notes detailing the progression of the experiments. There were mentions of drugs that were never approved for human use, as well as references to surgeries that were performed in complete secrecy. But the most disturbing discovery came in the form of an old, leather-bound journal, tucked away in a dusty cabinet. It was Dr. Blackwell's journal. As investigators began to read through the journal, they were horrified by the twisted rationale Blackwell had used to justify his actions. He believed that in order to unlock the deepest recesses of the human mind, he had to break his patients, to strip away their humanity and rebuild them from the ground up. He believed that the key to understanding the human soul lay in the destruction of the body. He wrote of his obsession with reprogramming the human psyche, his desire to create the perfect subject, someone who could withstand any treatment, who could endure the harshest of conditions without breaking. The journal was filled with chilling descriptions of the procedures he had performed, many of which had no basis in science. Some of his experiments were cruel beyond belief: brain surgeries performed on patients without anesthesia, chemical cocktails injected into the veins of the mentally ill, all in the name of science. But the most disturbing part of the journal was a single line, written in hastily scrawled handwriting: "The perfect mind can only be created through total destruction." As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, a horrifying picture emerged. Dr. Blackwell wasn't just a misguided scientist, he was a man driven by a dangerous obsession with control and power. He had used the asylum as his personal laboratory, and the patients were his guinea pigs. The building, once a place of healing, had become a prison for those who had the misfortune of coming under Blackwell's care. And the more they uncovered, the more they realized that the full extent of his crimes had yet to be revealed. There were rumors that the asylum's darkest secrets were not confined to its walls. Some believed that Blackwell had been part of a much larger conspiracy, that he had been working with other institutions and powerful figures in the medical field to conduct experiments far beyond the scope of what was known to the public. As investigators dug deeper, they found more questions than answers. What had really happened to the patients who had vanished without a trace? And was Blackwell truly the mastermind behind the horrors of the asylum, or was he just a pawn in a far larger, far more sinister game? For now, the building stood empty, a silent witness to the crimes that had been committed within. But the questions lingered, unanswered and unresolved. The truth was still hidden somewhere within those decaying walls, waiting to be uncovered. And as the wind howled through the ruins, one could almost hear the faint whispers of the past, calling out from the darkness, begging to be heard. The asylum, now a shadow of its former self, had a history that many would prefer to forget. Once a symbol of progress and compassion, it had been established with the grand idea of providing a sanctuary for those afflicted with mental illness. The original vision had been noble, a place of healing, where the afflicted could be cared for, restored, and returned to society as productive members. But that vision slowly deteriorated, replaced by something darker, more insidious. And as the years passed, whispers began to circulate, whispers about the things that happened behind those imposing stone walls. It was a place that had once been filled with hope, but that hope was slowly crushed under the weight of the asylum's dark secrets. The early days had seen a steady influx of patients, men, women, and children, each one arriving with their own personal battles and struggles. They had been promised treatment, a chance to heal, to recover from whatever mental afflictions had plagued them. They had been promised care and compassion. But over time, the reality of the asylum's treatment methods began to shift. In the beginning, the treatment was relatively conventional: talk therapy, a gentle hand, and the use of less intrusive methods. But as the years went by and the number of patients grew, the staff began to struggle with resources. The building, which was designed to house only a few hundred patients, had become overcrowded. New arrivals poured in, and the system was stretched to its breaking point. The asylum's capacity increased, but the quality of care declined. What had once been a sanctuary of healing soon turned into a crowded, overburdened institution, its halls echoing with the sounds of desperate souls. It wasn't long before the asylum's reputation began to change. Patients began to disappear, their names slipping from the records without explanation. Families who visited their loved ones would leave in confusion, unable to find answers. The staff seemed distant, reluctant to speak about the conditions of the facility, and rumors of mistreatment started to spread. Some said the asylum staff was understaffed, others claimed the doctors had become too jaded, too disillusioned by the overwhelming number of patients. But there was something more, something darker. And that darkness began to seep into every corner of the asylum. One of the first signs of something sinister emerged when a family arrived to visit their loved one, only to find that their relative had been moved to an entirely different part of the facility without notice. They were told that their family member had been transferred for further treatment, but when the family went to visit, they were given no specific details. The patient's records were mysteriously incomplete, their name almost entirely erased from the documentation. The family demanded answers, but the staff remained tight-lipped. It wasn't just one family that was affected by this secrecy. Several other patients disappeared in the same manner, their families left in the dark. Some never even received a notification that their loved ones had passed away. And those who did were given vague and unsatisfactory explanations. The asylum had become a black hole where people were lost, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. No one seemed to care about the truth. But amid all the whispers and rumors, one name began to surface again and again, Dr. Edward Blackwell. A renowned psychiatrist, Dr. Blackwell had come to the asylum in the early 1920s, bringing with him new ideas about the treatment of mental illness. He was charismatic, ambitious, and driven by a desire to break new ground in the field of psychiatry. He believed that the human mind was an untapped frontier, one that could be manipulated and reshaped. The possibilities, in his mind, were endless. Dr. Blackwell's arrival at the asylum was seen as a blessing by many. He was a brilliant man, a graduate of some of the most prestigious medical schools in the country. He had spent years studying the intricacies of the human mind, and his work was heralded as cutting-edge. His theories about mental illness were revolutionary. He believed that the root causes of mental disorders were deeply psychological, not just biological. This, of course, put him at odds with the more traditional psychiatrists, who focused primarily on physical treatments. Blackwell's theories were radical. He believed that patients suffering from mental illnesses could be cured by manipulating their minds, by altering their perceptions of reality. His methods, while unconventional, were seen as groundbreaking. He introduced new forms of therapy, electroshock treatment, deep hypnosis, and experimental drug regimens. These were just the beginning of what would become a disturbing pattern. But as Blackwell's influence grew, so did the rumors. The whispers about the asylum's mistreatment of patients became more frequent, and the word experiment began to be used in hushed tones. At first, it was easy to dismiss these rumors as the idle gossip of disgruntled former patients or paranoid families. But as time went on, there were more and more accounts of patients who had undergone Blackwell's treatments, only to emerge from them radically changed, if not entirely broken. The treatments themselves were brutal, often involving invasive procedures that went well beyond what was necessary. Electroshock therapy, a practice that was becoming more widely accepted in psychiatric circles, was pushed to the extreme under Blackwell's direction. Patients would be subjected to high-voltage shocks intended to reset their minds, leaving them often in a state of confusion or unconsciousness. The goal, as Blackwell explained it, was to erase their old selves and start anew, a clean slate on which to build a healthier mind. But the results were not as expected. Rather than healing, patients often experienced severe side effects, memory loss, emotional instability, and even permanent brain damage. Some were left in a catatonic state, unable to communicate or function. Others showed signs of severe psychological trauma, their minds irreparably altered by the shock treatments. And then there were the drugs. Blackwell was an advocate of what he referred to as mind-altering substances, chemicals that were still untested and largely unknown to the scientific community. His belief was that by flooding the brain with these substances, he could force a breakthrough, unlock the mental blocks that were holding the patients back. The drugs, many of which were lethal in high doses, were given to patients without their consent or even their knowledge. Some of these substances had severe psychological and physical consequences, often leaving patients in a state far worse than they had been in before. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators uncovered records of Blackwell's experiments that had been deliberately hidden. These experiments went beyond just drugs and electroshock therapy. Blackwell had begun performing surgeries on his patients, highly invasive, experimental surgeries designed to alter the brain's structure. He believed that by physically altering the brain, he could cure the mind of its disorders. These surgeries were conducted in complete secrecy, with no oversight or approval. Some patients were subjected to lobotomies, a procedure that involved cutting or destroying parts of the brain in an effort to alter behavior. Others were given experimental brain implants, devices that were intended to alter their cognitive functions. But the surgeries had devastating consequences. Many patients were left incapacitated, their personalities completely altered. Some died as a result of the procedures. But all were victims of Dr. Blackwell's unchecked ambition. As the asylum's dark secrets began to unravel, the question remained, why had no one stepped in to stop Blackwell? Why had his practices gone unchecked for so long? The answer, it seemed, lay in the asylum's administration, which had turned a blind eye to his increasingly bizarre and dangerous treatments. In the world of psychiatry, Blackwell was a man of great reputation, a pioneer. His influence was vast, and those who might have challenged him were either too afraid or too enamored with his ideas to speak out. It wasn't until the asylum was being decommissioned, its doors finally being shut for good, that the full extent of the horrors within was revealed. Investigators began to dig through the abandoned building's records, and what they uncovered shocked even the most seasoned experts. The asylum had been hiding far more than just its failing infrastructure. It had been hiding a legacy of cruelty, of unchecked power, and of lives destroyed by the very people who were supposed to heal them. But what made the situation even more disturbing was the realization that this wasn't just an isolated incident. There were other institutions, other asylums, that had been following similar practices, using similar methods. Dr. Blackwell's methods may have been extreme, but they were not unique. The asylum had been a breeding ground for ideas that would go on to shape psychiatric practices for decades to come, many of which remain controversial to this day. The walls of the asylum may have been crumbling, but its legacy was far from over. The question of how far Blackwell's influence had spread, and how many other patients had suffered under similar treatments, would continue to haunt those who uncovered the truth. The full scope of his experiments, and the lives he destroyed, had only just begun to be understood. And in the quiet darkness of the abandoned asylum, the echoes of the past still lingered. Dr. Edward Blackwell, a name that would become synonymous with both pioneering psychiatric treatment and incomprehensible cruelty, had arrived at the asylum in the early 1920s with the weight of high expectations on his shoulders. Tall, sharp-eyed, and confident, Blackwell was seen as a visionary. His theories about mental illness were considered radical yet promising, an exciting divergence from the traditional psychiatric practices of the time. For a man of his caliber, the asylum was merely a stepping stone, a place where he could experiment with his groundbreaking ideas on a grand scale. Little did anyone know that the institution would become the setting for his most controversial and dangerous experiments that would leave deep scars, not just on his patients, but on the very field of psychiatry itself. When Blackwell first arrived, he was lauded by both colleagues and the public. He quickly gained favor by promising to revolutionize the treatment of mental illness. The asylum, which had been in operation for almost 2 decades, was struggling to cope with an increasing number of patients, most of whom suffered from a range of psychiatric disorders, depression, schizophrenia, and anxiety, to name a few. The building itself, which had once been a symbol of hope, had become overcrowded and underfunded, filled with patients who were often left to languish in their own despair. Blackwell's approach was different from what had been seen before. Where others believed in more traditional therapies like talk therapy or the use of sedatives to calm patients, Blackwell was convinced that mental illness could be cured by far more invasive methods. His initial treatments were grounded in the emerging fields of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, and hypnosis. However, his focus was never just on curing symptoms, his obsession lay in understanding the root causes of these disorders. He was determined to break the human mind down to its core and rebuild it, stronger and more stable than before. What was once hailed as revolutionary soon descended into something darker, a series of experiments that would cross ethical lines and shatter lives forever. At first, patients seemed to respond to Blackwell's methods. Some were reported to show brief improvements after shock therapy or hypnosis. The community's faith in him grew, and so did his power within the asylum. But beneath the surface, something much darker was brewing. What was considered a cutting-edge treatment by Blackwell began to evolve into something more sinister. As his methods grew more extreme, so did the number of patients who were either too incapacitated to respond or, worse, disappeared entirely. Whispers among the staff began to circulate, but they were quickly dismissed. Most of the asylum staff was intimidated by Blackwell's stature. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a force of nature, a man whose brilliance and ambition eclipsed any concerns about ethics or the well-being of his patients. The staff had come to believe that he was too important to question. After all, Blackwell was on the cutting edge of psychiatric treatment. He was seen as the future of mental health care, and challenging him would risk everything they had worked for. Yet, there were others who weren't so easily swayed. A few nurses and junior staff members, less invested in the asylum's reputation, began to quietly voice their concerns. They had started noticing something odd: patients were being moved between departments under strange circumstances. These patients were often never seen again, their names quietly erased from records. When the staff asked about their whereabouts, Blackwell's answers were vague and nonchalant, often brushing off their concerns with assurances that the patients had been transferred or discharged for further treatment. But these answers never seemed to satisfy the staff's growing sense of unease. One of the first to speak out was Nurse Margaret Wren, a young woman who had only recently started working at the asylum. Margaret had been assigned to Dr. Blackwell's ward, and in her early days, she had been impressed by his confidence and intelligence. His reputation as a forward-thinking psychiatrist seemed to justify his unorthodox methods. But as time passed, Margaret began to feel uncomfortable with the nature of his treatments. The more she saw, the more she began to suspect that something was horribly wrong. It started with one patient, a woman in her mid-30s named Anne, who had been admitted for severe depression. Anne's husband had reported that she had been withdrawn and had lost interest in everything around her. Her condition had worsened after a series of traumatic events. She had lost her job and, soon after, a close family member to illness. For Anne, the world had become an overwhelming place, and she was no longer able to cope with the pain. In an attempt to help her, Blackwell ordered a regimen of electroconvulsive therapy. At first, there was no immediate change. Anne continued to slip further into despair, her emotions distant and hollow. But Blackwell insisted that more treatments were necessary, stronger doses of electricity, longer sessions. In one instance, Anne underwent several back-to-back sessions of ECT in an attempt to shock her mind back to health. The effects of the therapy were devastating. Her memory began to fade, and she would often lose consciousness for days at a time. But still, Blackwell refused to stop the treatments, convinced that the only way to cure her was to break her. When Margaret tried to speak with Blackwell about her concerns, he dismissed her, telling her that the process was difficult but necessary. He explained that, in time, the patient's mind would reset, and the memories and emotions would gradually return. However, the results of Anne's treatment were catastrophic. Anne's condition continued to deteriorate, and eventually, she died from complications related to the shock therapy. Yet, there was no investigation into her death, no attempt to explain why such a tragedy had occurred. Instead, the official report merely stated that Anne had failed to respond to treatment, and her file was quietly closed. Margaret's suspicions only grew as more patients under Blackwell's care began to exhibit similar symptoms. One patient, a young man named Thomas, had been subjected to a series of surgeries in an attempt to treat what Blackwell described as psychosomatic disorders. These were experimental procedures meant to alter the structure of the brain in an effort to alleviate symptoms of severe anxiety. But Thomas never recovered. Instead, his behavior grew increasingly erratic, and his once vibrant personality became a shadow of its former self. He, too, was marked as a failure of treatment, and his file disappeared without further explanation. Despite the mounting evidence that something was gravely wrong, no one spoke out. Blackwell's influence continued to grow. The patients who survived his treatments were often too broken to remember what had happened to them, and the families of the deceased were given nothing but silence. And so, Blackwell's experiments continued, unchallenged and unchecked, as he pushed the boundaries of what could be done to the human mind. But Blackwell's obsession with his experiments wasn't just about improving treatment for mental illness. There was something deeper, something more personal, driving him, a belief that he could unlock the mysteries of the human psyche, control it, and bend it to his will. His goal was not just to treat his patients, but to perfect them, to create a new kind of human being, someone who was free from the shackles of emotional distress and psychological suffering. His experiments became more bizarre as time went on. He began conducting surgeries that involved removing parts of the brain, performing lobotomies on patients with little regard for the potential consequences. These patients, who had once been fully capable of functioning in society, were now left in permanent vegetative states, unable to care for themselves or even communicate. Some were left with no memory, others unable to speak or recognize loved ones. And yet, in Blackwell's eyes, they were successes, because they no longer experienced the psychological pain that had once plagued them. The asylum's management, for their part, remained silent. The institution was becoming more and more profitable, thanks to Blackwell's work. He was gaining a reputation as a genius, a man who was on the cutting edge of mental health treatment. No one wanted to challenge that. No one wanted to be the one to stand up and say that what was happening inside the asylum was nothing short of torture. The patients had become little more than subjects in Blackwell's twisted experiments, and no one seemed to care. It wasn't until years later, after the asylum was shut down and the investigation began, that the full extent of Blackwell's abuses came to light. But by then, many of his patients had been forgotten, their stories buried under layers of bureaucracy and lies. The truth was that Dr. Edward Blackwell had been a pioneer, one who had opened doors to new ideas, but had done so at a devastating cost. His legacy would forever be one of pain, manipulation, and the destruction of lives in the name of science. As the years passed, the asylum's reputation continued to deteriorate, but it wasn't until the late 1940s that a wave of disappearances started to alarm the local community. The asylum, once a place of hope, had become a dark, insular world unto itself. It was a world where patients were no longer seen as individuals, but as experiments, broken minds that could be fixed at any cost, even if that meant violating their basic human rights. The treatments, which had begun with the promise of healing, had spiraled out of control, leaving the patients vulnerable to manipulation and abuse. And now, something even darker was taking place. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. First, a patient would go missing. Then another. The families would show up, as they always did, asking questions, demanding to see their loved ones, only to be told that their relatives had been moved to another facility, or that they were being treated in a more secure part of the asylum. The staff's responses were vague, their faces unreadable, but no one seemed to ask the questions that should have been asked. No one seemed to care enough to investigate. The asylum had become a place of secrecy, and the staff, long used to the shadows, had grown comfortable there. One such family was the Montags, who had lost their daughter, Lily, to the asylum. Lily had been struggling with severe anxiety and depression, brought on by the trauma of losing her mother at a young age. When she was admitted to the asylum, her family had been hopeful that, with the right care, she might finally find relief. But Lily's condition only worsened. Her parents had visited her regularly in the beginning, but over time, their visits became more and more sporadic. Each time they came, they were given more excuses, more delays, until eventually, they were told that Lily had been moved to a more specialized ward. But Lily had never been moved. She had vanished. The Montagues were devastated, but when they went to the asylum's administration, they were met with cold indifference. The staff could not provide any details, and when they pressed further, they were told that Lily had been discharged. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but it made no sense. Lily hadn't been discharged. She was still a patient, still under the asylum's care. Yet, the paperwork was all in order, and no one could explain where she had gone. The disappearance of Lily Montague was just one of many. Other families, too, began to notice that their loved ones were no longer responding to their calls or letters. Some had been in the asylum for years, and now, they were simply gone, their names erased from the records. The families who sought answers were met with the same evasions, the same cryptic explanations. But none of them ever received the closure they needed. It wasn't until a group of concerned former staff members, including some of the nurses who had worked alongside Dr. Blackwell, began to speak out that the full extent of the disappearances became clear. These whistleblowers, many of whom had kept silent for decades, started to reveal what had really been happening behind the asylum's closed doors. According to their accounts, the disappearances were not a series of isolated incidents, but part of a much larger, systematic effort to conceal the horrors of Dr. Blackwell's work. The patients who had disappeared had, in fact, been subjected to more extreme treatments than ever before, experiments that went beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The asylum had become a place where patients could no longer be counted as individuals, but were instead considered expendable. They were no longer seen as people in need of care, but as disposable subjects for Blackwell's increasingly erratic and dangerous experiments. Those who were considered difficult or uncooperative were taken away in the dead of night, often without warning or explanation. They were never heard from again. Some of the whistleblowers spoke of secret rooms deep within the asylum, hidden chambers where Blackwell conducted his most invasive and secretive procedures. These rooms were kept off limits to everyone except a select few of Blackwell's closest colleagues, and even then, the work that was carried out there was done in complete secrecy. The rooms were equipped with strange medical instruments, many of which were unapproved for use, and the procedures that took place were nothing short of barbaric. One of the former nurses, a woman named Edith Simmons, described a particular experiment that had haunted her for years. She recalled one patient, a young woman named Evelyn, who had been brought to the asylum after suffering from severe delusions and paranoia. Evelyn had been subjected to a series of shock treatments, but they had only worsened her condition. When Blackwell's other methods failed, he decided to try something more extreme. He performed an experimental surgery on Evelyn, removing part of her brain in an effort to cure her psychosis. The surgery was a failure. Evelyn's mind, already fragile, was shattered by the procedure. She became a shell of the person she once was, unable to speak, unable to recognize even her own family. Edith, who had been assigned to care for Evelyn after the surgery, recalled how the young woman's once vibrant personality had been replaced by a blank stare. She had become a ghost, a mere shadow of herself. And yet, there was no investigation, no inquiry into the incident. Evelyn's file was marked as failure, and her name was quietly removed from the records. But Evelyn's story was not unique. There were countless others who had suffered similar fates. Some of the patients had been subjected to lobotomies, invasive surgeries that destroyed parts of their brains in a vain attempt to cure their conditions. Others were subjected to chemical experiments, their bodies pumped full of drugs that had never been tested on humans. The staff, many of whom had been trained to believe that Blackwell was a genius, turned a blind eye to the horrors happening around them. They had been trained to see these experiments as necessary, even though deep down, they knew something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the patients who suffered in silence. The families, too, were left to grapple with their grief and confusion. Some of them eventually sought legal recourse, but by then, the asylum's records had been meticulously cleaned. Blackwell, ever the cunning manipulator, had ensured that much of the evidence of his wrongdoings was hidden or destroyed. The families were left with nothing but unanswered questions and a growing sense of unease. The truth, as they would come to realize, was far darker than they could have ever imagined. As more families came forward with their own stories of lost loved ones, the investigation into the asylum deepened. Law enforcement, along with a team of dedicated historians and medical experts, began to comb through the asylum's records. What they uncovered was nothing short of horrifying. In addition to the missing patients, they found evidence of countless illegal and unethical treatments. The shocking revelations came one after another. Patients had been subjected to drugs that had never been approved for human use, experimental surgeries had been performed without consent, and some patients had been used as test subjects in procedures that were not only unapproved but downright dangerous. The full scope of the abuse at the asylum was becoming clear, and with it, the realization that Blackwell's influence had extended far beyond the walls of the institution. He had been a part of a much larger network of doctors and researchers who had been pushing the boundaries of medical ethics, conducting experiments on vulnerable populations in the name of science. The asylum was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that was now slowly starting to fall apart. As the investigation continued, more and more people came forward with their own stories of abuse. Survivors of Blackwell's experiments, those who had somehow managed to escape the asylum, shared their testimonies, detailing the horrors they had endured. Some spoke of the brutal shock therapies, while others described the cruel surgeries that had left them physically and mentally scarred. But all of them shared one thing in common, the unshakable feeling that they had been nothing more than lab rats in Blackwell's twisted experiments. The asylum, once seen as a beacon of hope, had become a house of horrors, a place where the most vulnerable were subjected to the worst kind of treatment. And as the truth came to light, it became clear that the real victims were not just the patients who had been lost, but also the doctors and nurses who had turned a blind eye to the suffering happening in front of them. Many of them, too, would be haunted by the things they had witnessed, the things they had allowed to happen. But even now, as the truth continues to surface, the legacy of the asylum lingers. The building, long abandoned, stands as a silent witness to the pain and suffering that took place within its walls. And the question remains, how many other institutions, hidden away from the public eye, are still carrying out similar experiments, pushing the boundaries of medical ethics, and leaving behind a trail of broken lives? As the investigation into the asylum deepened, it became increasingly clear that the truth was far more horrifying than anyone could have anticipated. The asylum, which had been shrouded in mystery for decades, was beginning to reveal its darkest secrets. The more the authorities uncovered, the more they realized that Dr. Edward Blackwell's experiments were not isolated incidents, they were part of a much larger, systematic effort to alter the human mind, to reshape it into something that suited the desires of the medical community, regardless of the cost to the patients. One of the most chilling aspects of the investigation was the discovery of the asylum's extensive network of collaborators. Blackwell had not been working alone. As it turned out, the asylum was just one part of a far-reaching network of institutions and research facilities that had been conducting similar experiments across the country. Many of the top psychiatric hospitals had been involved in pushing the boundaries of medical ethics, experimenting on vulnerable populations without their consent, and in some cases, without their knowledge. Blackwell, with his charismatic personality and reputation as a pioneer in the field of psychiatry, had been the perfect figurehead for this movement. He had been trusted, respected, and even revered, which allowed him to push the boundaries of medical science without being questioned. The investigation revealed that many of Blackwell's colleagues, including prominent psychiatrists and neurologists, had been complicit in these experiments. Some had provided funding for the research, others had helped to design the procedures, and still more had played active roles in conducting the experiments on unsuspecting patients. The scale of the operation was staggering. It wasn't just an isolated group of rogue doctors, it was a widespread network of professionals who believed, perhaps even genuinely, that they were advancing the field of psychiatry. But their methods were nothing short of monstrous. The patients, most of whom had entered the asylum seeking treatment for relatively mild mental health issues, had become pawns in this dangerous game of experimentation. Some had been institutionalized for minor conditions such as anxiety or depression, while others had been committed due to familial pressure or social stigma. Many were vulnerable, isolated individuals who had nowhere else to turn. And these were the people who were subjected to the most horrific of treatments: brutal shock therapies, experimental drugs, lobotomies, and surgeries that had no basis in medical science. The patients who survived these procedures were often left in a state far worse than they had been when they entered. Their minds were shattered, their personalities erased, and their bodies damaged beyond repair. Many were left in comas, unable to communicate or even recognize their loved ones. Some were left with permanent physical disabilities, while others were left mentally incapacitated, unable to live independently or care for themselves. The victims were not only forgotten by society but often silenced by the very institution that was meant to protect them. One of the most disturbing revelations came from the discovery of detailed medical records that had been carefully concealed in the asylum's archives. These records, once painstakingly hidden away, were now exposed for all to see. They revealed the full extent of Blackwell's experiments, ranging from experimental brain surgeries to the administration of dangerous, untested drugs. The records were littered with notes about patients who had been subjected to the most invasive and unapproved treatments, some of which had caused irreversible damage. There were references to surgeries performed on patients without consent, and in some cases, without even the knowledge of the patients' families. The chilling notes described how Blackwell had pushed the boundaries of ethical medical practice, convinced that his methods were for the greater good, even as they caused unimaginable suffering. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence found in the asylum's archives was a series of photographs that documented the results of Blackwell's most extreme experiments. These photos, some of which were so graphic they were barely bearable to look at, showed the faces of patients before and after their treatments. The before and after images were striking. Patients who had once been vibrant and full of life were now reduced to blank, vacant expressions. The transformation was stark, as if their very essence had been erased. Some of the patients had undergone lobotomies or brain surgeries, their faces frozen in a state of horror or confusion. Others had been subjected to prolonged electroshock therapy, their bodies contorted in painful positions as the electrical current ravaged their minds. The photos were a visual testament to the horrors that had taken place inside the asylum. They were evidence of the brutality that had been perpetrated in the name of medical science, and they were a reminder of the patients who had been treated as little more than experiments, disposable, expendable, and forgotten. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to piece together the connections between the asylum and other medical institutions. It became apparent that Blackwell's experiments had not been confined to just this one facility. He had been in contact with other hospitals and research centers, exchanging ideas, protocols, and even patients. Blackwell's reputation as a pioneering psychiatrist had given him access to some of the most influential medical minds of his time, and with that access, he had been able to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable treatment. The network of collaborators extended across state lines, and the influence of Blackwell's experiments had spread far beyond the asylum walls. The investigation also uncovered a disturbing trend. Many of the patients who had been subjected to these experiments were not just mentally ill individuals, but also marginalized groups, the poor, the disabled, and people of color. These individuals were seen as expendable by the medical community, their lives deemed less valuable than those of more affluent or socially accepted people. In some cases, the asylum had taken in patients who were simply unwanted, people who had been cast aside by society for reasons beyond their control. They were the perfect subjects for Blackwell's experiments, people who were not expected to be believed if they spoke out and whose suffering would go unnoticed by the broader community. The asylum's legacy was not just one of physical and psychological abuse, it was also a reflection of the systemic neglect and exploitation that existed within the medical field at the time. It was a legacy of inequality, where the most vulnerable were treated as little more than objects to be studied, manipulated, and discarded. And as the truth began to come to light, the public was forced to confront the ugly reality of how far medical professionals would go in the pursuit of knowledge and power. The survivors of Blackwell's experiments, though few in number, began to come forward with their own stories of suffering. These individuals, once broken by the asylum's treatments, were now speaking out in an effort to reclaim their lives and their voices. Many of them had spent years in the asylum, subjected to cruel and inhumane treatments that had left them physically and mentally scarred. Some had been able to escape, but others had spent decades trying to rebuild their shattered minds. These survivors were among the few who could speak the truth of what had really happened inside those walls. One such survivor was Samuel, a man who had been admitted to the asylum in his early 20s for what was diagnosed as severe depression. His family had been hopeful that the asylum's treatments would help him recover, but instead, Samuel became another victim of Blackwell's experiments. He had undergone multiple shock therapy sessions, each one more extreme than the last. Eventually, Blackwell decided to perform a lobotomy on Samuel, an attempt to rid him of the mental disorder that had plagued him. The surgery left Samuel a shell of his former self. He was unable to speak, unable to move without assistance, and unable to recognize his family. For years, Samuel had lived in a permanent state of confusion and despair, unable to recall his past or his family's love. It wasn't until the asylum was shut down and the investigation began that Samuel's family was able to learn the full extent of the abuse he had suffered. They had been told that Samuel's condition was simply a result of his illness, that there had been no other options available. But the truth was far darker. Samuel's condition had been a direct result of Blackwell's experiments, and his family's grief was compounded by the realization that they had been lied to for decades. As the survivors continued to share their stories, a clearer picture emerged. The asylum, once seen as a place of healing, had become a place of torture. The patients who had entered with hope had left broken, their minds and bodies irreparably damaged. The records, the photographs, and the testimonies from survivors all painted the same grim picture, a picture of unchecked power, of a medical system that had gone too far, and of a society that had turned a blind eye to the suffering of its most vulnerable. But even as the investigation closed in on Blackwell and his collaborators, the question remained, how many more institutions were out there, hidden away from public view, still carrying out similar experiments? How many more patients were being subjected to the same horrors, in the name of medical progress? The full extent of Blackwell's influence was still unclear, and the truth was that the legacy of the asylum would continue to haunt not just the survivors, but society as a whole. The damage had been done, and the scars would never fully heal. The asylum had claimed too many lives, and its secrets had been buried too deep for anyone to truly escape its shadow. The full scale of Dr. Blackwell's experiments was beginning to unfold, but there was something unsettlingly unquantifiable about it, something that could never be entirely captured by the testimony of survivors, the shocking photographs, or the detailed medical records that had been uncovered. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized that the asylum was not just a place of medical malpractice, it was a symbol of a larger cultural and medical crisis that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Dr. Blackwell, with all his genius and charisma, had manipulated an entire system, a system that had turned a blind eye to ethics and the well-being of patients in the name of scientific progress. Even as the truth began to spill out, it was impossible to ignore the fact that Blackwell had been part of a much larger problem within psychiatry and the medical establishment. He had been a part of a wave of experimentation in the early 20th century that had swept across the country, where doctors and researchers were pushing the boundaries of human psychology and brain science, often without a moral compass to guide them. What Blackwell had done at the asylum was not an anomaly, it was an extension of a trend that had been growing within psychiatric and medical circles for decades. And what was even more disturbing was that, at the time, his colleagues and the wider public had been largely complicit in this unethical exploration of the human mind. In the aftermath of the asylum's closure and the subsequent investigation, Blackwell's reputation as a pioneering figure in psychiatry was quickly erased. His name, once synonymous with groundbreaking treatments, was now linked to brutality, manipulation, and cruelty. But the damage was not confined to Blackwell alone. The very institution that had allowed his practices to flourish became a symbol of the medical community's failure to protect vulnerable patients from exploitation. The question that persisted throughout the investigation was this: how had so many people, doctors, administrators, and even patients, been so blind to the horror that had taken place behind those thick stone walls? At the heart of the asylum's operations was its capacity for secrecy. For decades, the staff had managed to keep the public and the patients' families at bay, maintaining the illusion that the treatments were working, that the patients were being cared for, and that Blackwell's methods were nothing but a part of the cutting-edge advancements in the field of mental health. The asylum had become an almost impenetrable fortress, with its doors tightly shut to the outside world, and anyone who dared question its practices was either silenced or dismissed as uninformed. The patients, too, were rendered voiceless. Once inside, they were cut off from the outside world, their families unable to gain meaningful insight into their treatment or their well-being. They had become nothing more than numbers in an ever-growing system, casualties of a medical machine that prioritized experimentation over compassion. For those who had worked within the asylum's walls, the process of erasing the truth was both deliberate and methodical. The records of the most egregious treatments had been deliberately destroyed or altered, leaving investigators with only fragments of evidence. But despite this effort to cover up the extent of the abuse, it soon became clear that the truth would not remain buried. Survivors began to speak out, and their voices became the key to unraveling the asylum's dark legacy. Many of them had lived with the trauma for years, haunted by memories of the treatments they had been subjected to, the experiments that had left them mentally and physically scarred. These survivors, many of whom had never spoken about their experiences before, now found the courage to share their stories, knowing that the truth needed to be told. One such survivor was Hannah, a woman who had spent several years in the asylum as a young girl. She had been admitted to the facility after suffering a breakdown following the loss of her parents in a tragic accident. At first, the doctors had treated her with what seemed to be compassion, prescribing her medications and talking to her about her grief. But as time passed, she began to experience the subtle but unsettling changes that came with Blackwell's experimental treatments. She was subjected to shock therapy multiple times, each session leaving her more disoriented and detached from reality. After each treatment, she would wake up with no memory of what had happened, only to be told that it was necessary for her recovery. She never saw her parents again. Eventually, she was moved to a more secluded part of the asylum, where her treatments grew even more invasive. It was there that she first learned of the lobotomies being performed on patients. Hannah, unlike many of the others, managed to escape the asylum after a nurse, a woman who had grown increasingly concerned about the treatments being administered, secretly helped her to flee. But the memories of her time there never left her. As an adult, she found herself haunted by the fragments of her past, by the faces of patients who had been taken away in the middle of the night, by the screams that echoed through the asylum's hallways long after the lights had been dimmed. For years, she had buried her trauma, too afraid to confront what had happened. But when the investigation into the asylum began, she realized that the only way to heal was to speak out, to share her story with the world. Her testimony, along with those of others, was the catalyst for the wider public's understanding of the horrors that had taken place within those walls. Another key figure in the investigation was Dr. Robert Sinclair, a psychiatrist who had once worked alongside Blackwell at the asylum. Unlike many of his colleagues, Dr. Sinclair had not been seduced by Blackwell's charisma or his ambitious theories. He had been a quiet, thoughtful man, driven by a genuine desire to help people. However, as he witnessed Blackwell's growing obsession with his experiments, he began to have serious doubts about the direction the asylum was taking. He saw the patients deteriorating, saw the medical staff becoming more and more complicit in Blackwell's methods, and finally, he could no longer remain silent. Dr. Sinclair had tried to warn others within the institution, but his concerns were dismissed. Eventually, he was forced to leave the asylum, unable to stand by and watch the suffering any longer. After Blackwell's practices were exposed, Dr. Sinclair became one of the key whistleblowers who helped to unravel the full scope of the asylum's abuse. He was one of the first to publicly denounce Blackwell's methods, speaking out about the experiments he had witnessed and the unethical practices that had been carried out under the guise of medical treatment. Dr. Sinclair's testimony, alongside those of survivors like Hannah, was crucial in building the case against Blackwell and his collaborators. It was also through his testimony that investigators were able to confirm that the asylum's treatments had not only been harmful but had, in many cases, caused irreparable damage to the patients. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the problem was far more widespread than anyone had imagined. The asylum was only one example of a larger problem within the medical establishment, an entire system that had been willing to sacrifice patients for the sake of scientific progress. The truth about Blackwell and his collaborators was shocking, but it was also part of a broader narrative about the unchecked power of the medical community and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals for the advancement of knowledge. In the wake of the revelations, the asylum was permanently closed, and its legacy became a painful reminder of the dangers of medical experimentation without ethical boundaries. The survivors who had spoken out found some measure of justice, but the emotional scars they carried would never fully heal. The families who had lost loved ones had their questions answered, but the answers were often far more difficult to process than the silence they had endured for so many years. And for the medical community, the scandal surrounding the asylum became a turning point, a reminder of the importance of ethical standards in medical research and the need for oversight in the treatment of the most vulnerable. The legacy of Dr. Blackwell and the asylum lived on long after the building itself had been abandoned. The scars of his experiments remained in the testimonies of the survivors, in the archives that documented his abuses, and in the cultural shift that followed the exposure of the truth. The investigation into the asylum had brought to light the darkest corners of psychiatric history, but it also served as a reminder that even in the pursuit of knowledge, there must be limits, a lesson that, sadly, many had learned too late. As the years passed, the abandoned asylum stood as a silent monument to the suffering that had taken place within its walls, its story a cautionary tale of ambition gone horribly wrong. As the years passed, the truth surrounding the asylum and Dr. Edward Blackwell's notorious experiments slowly began to fade from the public consciousness, but the scars left by the investigation remained deeply etched in the fabric of the community. The horrors that had been carried out in that forgotten institution had shattered the lives of countless individuals, but even as the world moved on, there remained unanswered questions and lingering doubts. In the shadows of history, the asylum had become a symbol, a cautionary tale of unchecked power, the abuse of trust, and the vulnerability of the human mind. The building itself, once a place of care and healing, had been abandoned. Its walls, now cracked and weathered, seemed to hold the ghosts of the past within them. The doors, long sealed, stood as a mute testimony to the suffering that had occurred within. The broken windows whispered of the lives shattered by Blackwell's experiments, and the dilapidated halls echoed with the faintest reverberations of the screams and cries that had been stifled by years of silence. Though the physical structure of the asylum had been left to rot, the legacy of its cruel history lingered in the memories of the survivors, the families, and the few who had dared to speak out. The survivors, those who had somehow managed to escape Blackwell's grip, were scattered across the country. Some had found healing, while others had struggled to rebuild their shattered lives. Many carried the weight of their time at the asylum with them, haunted by memories of the treatments, the isolation, and the torment they had endured. Even years after leaving, they remained marked by their experiences, some physically scarred by surgeries, others mentally and emotionally fractured by the shock treatments and manipulations that had been inflicted upon them. The scars were not just visible on their bodies, they ran deeper, affecting the very way they interacted with the world, the way they trusted others, and even how they saw themselves. They were not the same people who had entered the asylum all those years ago. The asylum had taken more than just their health, it had taken their identities, their sense of agency, and in some cases, their will to live. One such survivor was George, a man who had been institutionalized after suffering a mental breakdown following a series of personal tragedies. He had been a man once full of promise, with a family and a promising career ahead of him. But the shock treatments, the endless experiments, and the degradation of his autonomy had left him a different person. He had lost so much of himself during his time in the asylum: memories, emotions, his very sense of self. It had taken years of therapy, support, and introspection for George to even begin to piece together the fragments of his life, and even then, the pain of what had happened to him lingered, tucked away in the deepest parts of his mind. He could not forget what had been done to him, nor could he ever forgive those who had allowed it to happen. His story was just one among many, a life forever altered by the horrors of the asylum. But George had made a choice to reclaim his life, to speak out about the abuses he had suffered, even when it was difficult to relive the past. His voice, though quiet at first, grew louder as he found others who had shared similar experiences. Together, they formed a community of survivors, a group that had been bound together by their shared trauma and their shared resolve to ensure that the truth would never be forgotten. But even as survivors like George found strength in their unity, the question remained: how had this been allowed to happen in the first place? How had a man like Dr. Blackwell been able to manipulate an entire system, to twist it into something dark and monstrous? The answer, many believed, was rooted in a combination of factors: the medical community's insatiable thirst for knowledge, the unchecked power of the asylum, and the cultural attitudes of the time that allowed such abuses to go unnoticed or, worse, be ignored. The asylum had been a place where doctors held absolute authority, where patients were seen as little more than subjects to be studied, their suffering justified by the promise of medical progress. In a time when mental illness was still shrouded in mystery, when psychiatry was still in its infancy, the general public had placed its trust in the hands of doctors, believing that they were working for the betterment of society. Blackwell had played on that trust, using it to carry out his dark experiments, all while maintaining an image of scientific integrity. The patients, many of whom were poor, disabled, or marginalized, had been the most vulnerable to exploitation. They had entered the asylum seeking help, but what they had found was a nightmare. They had become objects, manipulated and subjected to cruel treatments, their suffering ignored in the name of scientific curiosity. And yet, no one had asked the most important question: at what cost did this progress come? In the quest for medical knowledge, the very humanity of the patients had been disregarded. The asylum, once a symbol of hope, had become a place of suffering, and Blackwell's experiments had turned it into a house of horrors. Though the asylum's doors had been shut, the aftershocks of its dark legacy rippled through the medical community and the families affected by it. The scandal that surrounded Blackwell's name was far-reaching. It not only tarnished the reputation of psychiatry, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the ethics of medical experimentation. The case became a turning point in the history of mental health treatment, prompting calls for reform and stricter regulations in the psychiatric field. It was a moment of reckoning for the medical community, one that would reshape the way mental illness was treated for decades to come. In the years following the asylum's closure, several lawsuits were filed by the families of deceased patients, as well as by survivors seeking compensation for the trauma they had suffered. But while some families found justice, others found the legal battles to be long and grueling, the scars of their experiences compounded by the legal and emotional toll of fighting for recognition. Some survivors, like George, found peace in the closure that came from exposing the truth, while others struggled to come to terms with the fact that so much of what had happened had been swept under the rug.